The late autumn wind was cold, and it went straight through my flimsy fleece jacket. I shivered, closed my eyes and felt my teeth chattering like a tap dancer high on speed. The physical discomfort, however, was not due to the cold. It was a direct result of the person that had been following me for the last hour. I turned my head and could see the dark shape behind me, about 40 yards or so. I quickly turned away and noticed that I found it difficult to breathe. Raw fear tends to have that effect on you. Realizing that you are being chased by a predator, and that this predator is most likely going to finish you off, feels like being suffocated by clammy, invisible hands. I kept walking and wished that I was back in the car, cruising down the road at a safe 55 miles an hour. Everything would have been alright then. But the damn thing had died on me in the middle of nowhere, in Yukon. And that's why I found myself in this life-threatening situation. It all began with a light vibrating motion coming from the engine. The adrenaline immediately shot into my bloodstream, and I prayed with all my heart that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down I knew that it couldn't be good. And a few minutes later this was confirmed when the car started to decelerate. Then it stopped altogether, despite me pushing the gas pedal all the way to the floor. "Oh, come on, god damn it!" I shouted, and slammed my palm hard against the steering wheel as I tried in vain to get it going again. But to no avail. The engine was as dead as the battery on my smartphone in the passenger seat next to me. I eventually let go of the ignition key and leaned my head against the headrest as I closed my eyes. A tiny tear of frustration started running down my cheek, and I knew that this was a really bad situation. The road was a narrow dirt strip about 40 miles west of the highway, surrounded by tall pine trees. Some might refer to the scenery as stunning, but if you were forced to walk along the side of the road in the evening during autumn, knowing that civilization was hours away and that no one was going to come to the rescue, the beauty of it would fade away rather quickly. And as I was sitting there in the driver's seat feeling sorry for myself, I made a disastrous decision. I decided to go looking for help. In hindsight, I realized that if I had stayed where I was, things would probably have turned out differently. But hindsight is for know-it-alls, and "if" is probably the most useless word in the English language. So instead I gathered all my things, the backpack, a water bottle, and the 2 trekking poles and got out, hoping that I'd run into someone that could lend me a helping hand. And an hour and a half later, I did run into someone. But I soon realized that it would have been better if I hadn't. And if I had known what I know now, I would have run in among the trees and not come out until the coast was clear. I had just cleared a crest, and before me was a long straight stretch of the road. And that's when I saw him, about 200 yards away, walking towards me. At first I was elated, but as he drew closer, that feeling changed, because he looked nothing like a person you wish to run into. He was dressed in worn old clothes, brown pants, and a jacket covered in holes. A woolen beanie was perched on top of his head, and he had thick brown boots on his feet. And to complement it all, he had a menacing-looking axe hanging from a rope that was tied around his waist. I slowed down, not really knowing what to do. It is not common courtesy to ignore people you run into on desolate roads, but that rule only applies to people who look normal and harmless. And this guy looked anything but. And for a moment, I seriously contemplated turning around or making my way in among the trees. But I knew that would only make things worse, so I kept moving as the distance between us kept getting smaller. And then eventually he was there, less than 6 yards away. I was scared, and I took a deep breath as I passed him on the other side of the road. I tried to avoid his gaze, and I was hoping with all my heart that he would keep walking and not pay me any attention. From the corner of my eye, I could see his piercing grey eyes looking at me without blinking. And I could see the ugly sneer on his face and the half a dozen missing teeth in his mouth. His long beard and thick mustache looked unkempt. And I immediately got the impression that I was looking at a hobo. I could hear him mumble something that sounded like French to me, and I felt a cold shudder run through me. "Just keep moving on and never mind me," I muttered under my breath and hoped the guy would take the advice. I couldn't get away from there fast enough and I kept walking. And a few minutes later, after I had worked up enough courage to turn around and see if the guy was gone, I felt my blood go cold. Because he hadn't continued on his merry way as I hoped. Instead, he had crossed the road and was now following me. He was about 40 yards behind me, the ugly grin still plastered on his lips. The piercing eyes appraising me like I was some kind of prey. I turned away as if someone had slapped me, and it took a massive effort to squeeze the remaining air out of my lungs. I wanted to turn around to make sure that my eyes hadn't deceived me, but I was physically incapable of doing so. I was scared out of my wits, and it was like someone had placed a neck brace under my chin, depriving me of any sideways motion. Nor was there any reason to turn around, because I knew very well that my eyes hadn't played a trick on me. The guy was most definitely there, and for some reason, he had decided to come after me. I increased my pace and felt the pain in my fingers as they gripped the trekking poles even tighter. Then the uncomfortable thoughts started popping up, and they did nothing to ease my already frayed nerves. The guy is going to attack me with that axe, I told myself. He'll probably plant it in the back of my skull. Then, when he's done, he'll bury me somewhere among the trees. Why the hell did I leave my car? I muttered to myself and felt the salt from a tear that had started forming in my eye duct. I continued walking for what seemed like ages, haunted by gruesome images and almost passing out from the paralyzing fear. The guy was massive, at least 6'7", and would have made an excellent bouncer at a rowdy biker bar. And I knew that I wouldn't stand a chance if he decided to attack me. Heck, the guy could probably rip me apart with his bare hands. I didn't want to look at him again, but I knew I had to. I had to find out if he was still following me, even though every fiber in my body told me that he was. So, by relying on sheer willpower, I was able to turn around once again, and to my horror, I could see that he had closed the distance between us. He was now less than 30 yards behind me. And that's when it hit me, like a punch in the gut. And I remembered the wanted poster I'd seen in Edmonton 3 weeks earlier. I couldn't recall his name, but I could clearly remember the nickname he'd been given, the Rambler. I also remembered the crimes he had committed: murder, assault, and torture. According to the poster, he had escaped from a prison facility a month and a half ago in Saskatoon and was believed to be hiding somewhere out in the vast northern wilderness. Yeah, they got that one right. He was walking 30 freaking yards behind me in the middle of nowhere in the sparsely populated Yukon territory, and there was no one here to save me. I shuddered and started hyperventilating. I closed my eyes again and tried to get a grip on the fear I was experiencing. I was going to die today. I knew that. But I didn't know at what time or why. I only knew that it would be brutal and painful. I continued walking for another 10 minutes or so before I turned around again and nearly collapsed when I saw that he was now holding the axe in his right hand. A big, meaty paw was wrapped around the lacquered hickory handle, and he was smacking the side of the axe blade against the massive palm of his left hand. I spun around and knew that the blade would soon slam into me. There would be a massive blow followed by a sharp pain, followed by another massive blow a few seconds later, and that would be it. I knew I had to do something. I had been walking for almost 2.5 hours by that stage, and I hadn't seen a single car drive past in that time. Nor had I seen any civilians other than the escaped murderer. My heart was pounding, and my mouth had gone completely dry. My mind was in total chaos, and there were a dozen voices screaming at me hysterically, telling me what to do. I cast a quick sideways glance in among the trees and the darkness beyond, and realized that the forest was my only option. It was dark enough to disappear in there, and if I was lucky, I would be able to find somewhere to hide. But what if I got away, but somehow got lost? There were other fierce predators of the four-legged kind in the forest, and they too would treat me as an easy target. For God's sakes, get a grip, I told myself in a shaky voice, just barely above a whisper. The only thing that matters now is to get away from this psycho. I quickened my pace again, ever so slightly, in an attempt to gain a few extra yards before I'd bolted into the forest. If I could just increase the distance between us, my odds of getting away would improve significantly. I continued for another couple of minutes before I slowly turned my head for the last time. Every muscle in my body was on edge, and I was prepared to sprint in among the trees within the next second, then run until I was unable to run any further. What the? I stopped dead in my tracks and was completely gobsmacked. The guy was no longer there. Where had he gone? I took a few steps backward and almost tripped as I studied the gap in the trees on either side. But there was no sign of the guy anywhere. Where the hell are you? What do you intend to do? I muttered to myself, my entire body shaking. I spent another few seconds trying to figure out what had happened, and then my survival instincts finally kicked in. Run, you moron. Run and get away from here. And that's what I did. I spun around and began running as fast as my legs could carry me. I quickly transferred the trekking poles to my right hand and felt the backpack bounce uncontrollably up and down as I bolted down the narrow dirt road in the diminishing light of the evening sky. I stopped 20 minutes later, completely spent. My lungs felt like they were on fire. My stomach was hurting like crazy. But I ignored the pain and stepped away from the road and hurried into the forest. The low-hanging branches scraped my face, but I didn't care. The only thing on my mind was to get away and find somewhere I could hide. Somewhere safe, where the murderer couldn't get to me. I sank down next to some fern bushes a few moments later. I had no idea whether the guy had followed me or not, but I couldn't hear any noises that suggested that he had. Nor had I seen him behind me as I slipped into the forest. I waited a few minutes before I got back up on my feet again and began walking further in among the trees, and eventually found a suitable hiding spot. I was too tired to be scared, and I hoped the darkness would give me the protection I needed. I sank down behind a pine tree, leaned the back of my head against its trunk, and closed my eyes. And not long thereafter, I fell asleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I heard the loud crack of a dry branch snapping, but it woke me up. And I was fully awake within a tenth of a second. I could see the beam from a flashlight about 40 or 50 yards away, and to my horror I realized that the person holding the flashlight was coming towards me. I knew instantly that it was the guy with the axe. He had somehow caught up with me, and now he was going to finish what he had intended to do all along. I couldn't move. The sweat started pouring down on my face, and I could feel my hands shaking uncontrollably. This time there was no escape. The light kept getting closer and closer, and I prepared myself for what would happen next. I closed my eyes and prayed that it would be over quickly. Another branch cracked, and I winced as if the guy had fired a rifle at me. He was close now. No more than 20 yards tops, and soon, very soon, he would be able to smell my fear. I held my breath and tried to prepare myself for the inevitable. The beam from the flashlight moved from side to side, and I could hear his boots as they touched the forest floor. Then all of a sudden, the movement stopped, and the lights disappeared. I threw open my eyes and sat absolutely still. Had he seen me? No, I don't think so. And if he had, why had he turned off the lights? It would be easier for him to finish me off with the aid of the light rather than in complete darkness. I gazed out into the night, but couldn't see a thing. Then I started counting, convinced that he'd swing that axe before I got to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4. But nothing happened. And I told myself that he'd do it before I got to 20. But 20 came and went, and no axe smashed into my head. What was he waiting for? I was drenched in sweat, and my body was shaking like the engine of my car, just before it had died on me. Was he toying with me, like a cat would toy with a mouse? Very slowly, I turned my head and scanned the area, but all I could see was impenetrable darkness. But even though I couldn't see him, I could smell him. He reeked of mold and old tobacco, and something else I didn't recognize. Another minute passed and the tension inside me was unbearable. But still nothing happened. All I could hear was the eerie silence of the forest and the light breeze caressing the treetops. I started to count again, wondering how far I'd get before the axe finally hit its target. But the blow never came. I counted for another 20 minutes, and during that time, I didn't hear a single sound. No boots moving away from me. No breathing, grunts or cursing. Nor did I see any more light. Even so, I sat there completely still, and for the rest of that night, I hardly moved a muscle. Nor did I sleep, or at least I don't think I did. And when the sun rose the next morning, I quickly made my way back onto the road and started walking again. And 6 hours after that, I finally saw a car and was able to flag it down. At last, I was safe. I did report the incident to the local police. I told them about everything that had happened, how the killer had followed me, and that I was convinced that it was the guy I had seen on the wanted poster in Edmonton. But the old sheriff just shook his head after I recounted my story and informed me that the guy on the wanted poster had been picked up a week ago in Vancouver. Then he pursed his lips and folded his hands on the desk and studied me. And when he decided he'd studied me long enough, he produced a book from the shelf above the desk. He flipped it open, found the picture he was after, and showed it to me. I pulled it closer and felt a jolt run through my body when my eyes rested on it. Then after 10 seconds or so, I looked back up at him. "That's the guy that followed me," I said. "There's no question about it." I lowered my gaze again and returned my attention to the picture. It was grainy and in black and white. The guy was wearing the same clothes, the same boots, and he had the same rope wrapped around his waist. He also had the same menacing-looking axe hanging from it. Very slowly, I moved my gaze towards the couple of paragraphs that had been written below it. I frowned as I read it, and looked up at the sheriff several times as I did so. But he just looked me straight in the eye with a deadpan expression. The text said that the guy's name was Cloud Peltier, a serial killer that was suspected of having murdered more than 40 people in the northern parts of Alberta, British Columbia, and Yukon in the late 1920s and early 30s. I was astonished. It couldn't be the same person. That was an impossibility. The guy would have been over 130 years old if he'd been alive today. But somehow it was. I was looking at the guy that had followed me on that road. "You're not the only person to claim to have seen Cloud," the sheriff said, as he pulled the book towards him and closed it. "Every 2 or 3 years, hunters, loggers, and hikers claims to have seen him in the area where he used to operate, and they have done so since the late 30s. He waited for a few moments before continuing. "And the funny thing is that they all say the same thing, that he followed them for a long time and then suddenly disappeared. I don't really know what to make of it, but somehow I find it strange that all these people come up with the same story." He got up from his chair to indicate that our conversation was over and walked over to the door leading out of the office and opened it. "My advice to you, son, is to avoid walking alone in that particular area. There are plenty of other places in this country of ours where you can enjoy the outdoors and all it has to offer. You should stick to those." Then he ushered me out and closed the door behind me, and I didn't know what to think. But I have followed his advice ever since. As a matter of fact, I have taken it one step further, because I never walk alone in any forest in Canada. I also make sure that I have a walking partner and a loaded rifle whenever I am in a desolate area. Because you can never be 100% sure. Cloud, or his doppelganger, might just pay you a visit if you choose to ignore the sheriff's advice, and once was more than enough for me. And heaven knows what old Cloud would do if he did catch up with me. That axe of his looked terribly sharp, and it has already sent dozens of people onwards to the afterlife.